Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh the facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and pony owner. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing easy keepers on multiple acres of pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and like all good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We talk about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
With that, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the following episode.
We're recording this episode on the first day of spring. For our listeners in the United States that were dealt a severe winter storm last weekend, I realize that spring probably feels a very long way off. Meanwhile, here in the desert Southwest, I think we've skipped spring altogether and gone straight to summer, as it's already 100 degrees today. So no matter where you are, spring is normally a season that allows everyone to get out and enjoy their horses. And for many, it marks the end of a season where we've been relying heavily on hay as the major forage source. As horses get out and work more, they'll be experiencing more oxidative stress, and that means that they need diets that provide adequate antioxidant support. However, winter diets can be low in antioxidants, meaning that your horse may not be adequately set up to handle the stress of the increased work that spring brings. Today, we're going to talk about vitamin E, why you should be testing your horse's levels, and why your horse might need some additional supplementation.
What is vitamin E?
Oh, hello. We're going to start right at the very beginning with what are we doing? What is it? So yeah, vitamin E is a fat-soluble vitamin. So we have fat-soluble and water-soluble vitamins. So it needs fat to be absorbed. And it's an antioxidant. And it's one of our essential nutrients, meaning that the horse can't make it. So it has to be in the diet. But it isn't actually a single molecule. It's actually a group of sort of related compounds called tocopherols and tocotrienols. And the most biologically active form in animals, anyway, is alpha tocopherol. And so when we talk about vitamin E, we use the term vitamin E, but in equine nutrition, what we're actually referring to is alpha tocopherol. So we just make it easy and just say vitamin E, but vitamin E is actually like a collective term for a bunch of these compounds. And specifically, we're most interested in alpha tocopherol.
If vitamin E is fat soluble, does that mean that it requires fat to be absorbed?
Yes, it does. So, and that's the case with all the fat soluble vitamins. And so the vitamin E is going to travel with the fat out of the digestive tract and pass with the fat through the digestive tract lining into the bloodstream.
Why do horses need vitamin E?
That's a great question, right? So I sort of hinted at it in the introduction about it being an antioxidant, but it helps protect the cells in the horse's body. So cells are made up with what we call a lipid bilayer. And I'm trying to think about how to kind of explain that to people that maybe don't remember their biology or never have done biology, or, that was a long time ago for a lot of us, right? So a bilayer is a 2-layer of fatty acids. And so one way to think about it is like having like a bread and butter sandwich. And so if you have your 2 layers of bread, those would be the water-loving exterior. And then you have butter on the inside, and that's what we call hydrophobic. It doesn't like water. And so that's sandwiched on the inside. And so then you have this is the bilayer that wraps around all the cells in our body. And so the vitamin E sits in that cell membrane. And then the fats in these membranes are particularly vulnerable to oxidative damage. So during normal metabolism, as we are burning fuels, or as we're burning fat, burning carbohydrate, for example, especially when we do that using oxygen to produce energy, what results from that process is you get byproducts of that, right? And the byproducts are unstable molecules called free radicals. Or if you want to be really fancy, they're called reactive oxygen species. But free radicals, people have probably heard of free radicals, which I always think of free radicals sound like sort of like political activists or something. I don't know. But anyway, but the free radicals are unstable because they're missing an electron. And I realize like we're heading into like chemistry and like, territory, but they're unstable and they want to be stable. And so in order to become stable, they need to find an electron from somewhere, right? And so what they do is they steal an electron from a nearby molecule, such as some of the fats that are in the cell bilayer. And then what happens is that then that the molecule they've stolen the electron from, now it's unstable because it's missing an electron. And so then it steals an electron from something else nearby. And you get this chain reaction of sort of oxidation that happens, and that's what we call oxidative stress, right? So this is what happens when you start getting this chain reaction of oxidative stress. And so antioxidants work by donating. They're very generous, right? They donate. They donate an electron to the free radical that's unstable, and they say, "Here, have this electron. You can have it, so you can be stable." And they have the ability to do that and remain relatively stable themselves, right? And so this then results in neutralizing this sort of free radical chain reaction, and it stops. And we then don't get the cell damage. Because if you think about it, if a free radical comes along and steals an electron from a fatty acid in the cell bilayer, and then that fatty acid steals another electron from another fatty acid, you start degrading that bilayer, and suddenly the structural integrity of your cell goes down, and bad things start to happen, right? So antioxidants are very generous. They work by donating an electron to free radicals without becoming unstable. And they're like shock absorbers. They absorb the damage before important cell structures can be harmed. And the vitamin E becomes mildly oxidized, but it's stable enough. And it can actually be regenerated back to its sort of normal, happy, healthy self through other antioxidants such as vitamin C. So some of our listeners might be aware that like vitamin C and E can sort of work together a little bit. And that's vitamin C helps to sort of like restabilize that vitamin E. So that's a long-winded explanation of, perhaps more detail than people really are interested in. But that's what's going on with sort of antioxidants and vitamin E and how they help protect cells in your body.
What does vitamin E do for a horse's body?
Yeah, specifically like just beyond the cell, like what does that actually do? Like sort of body-wise beyond the cell? Well, obviously, when we look at, where are the areas of the cell that have a lot of, fat in their membranes and things, right? We think about nerve cells and muscle cells, right? These contain a lot of these lipid bilayer cell membranes. And so vitamin E is particularly important for helping to protect muscle cells and nerve cells from damage, from oxidative damage. And obviously our muscle cells are also where we're generating a lot of energy when horses are working and moving, right? They're burning fuel in their muscles and therefore generating a lot of these free radical byproducts in their muscle cells. So vitamin E is specifically helping to protect muscle cells from damage. They're helping to protect nervous cells from damage as well. So it helps maintain proper neurological function. Vitamin E also plays a role in immune function, right? So it helps support the immune cells when they're fighting infections. Again, there's oxidative damage that could be happening during that sort of fight that's going on. And then another area that we don't think about perhaps with vitamin E is reproductive health. Vitamin E is very important for fertility and the healthy development of foals. And there are some conditions where, for example, I can't speak, for example, NAD, which is neuroaxonal dystrophy, is a condition where there is like a genetic predisposition to have the condition. And if that foal does not receive adequate vitamin E at the right moment in time, that switch gets turned on and that condition will then develop in later life. And so vitamin E is very important in our mares and young foals as well.
You mentioned in the introduction that horses coming out of winter may not have enough vitamin E to support the higher levels of oxidation that exercise causes. Why is that?
Mainly because during the winter months, like many of us don't have good quality pasture, and we're relying more heavily on hay as their forage source.
So horses don't get enough vitamin E from their hay?
Usually no. And so fresh pasture grass is good quality. Fresh pasture grass is very abundant in vitamin E. However, it's not heat stable. So when we make hay, when you cut that hay and you lay it in the field in the sun to dry, you basically get rid of a lot of the vitamin E that was naturally occurring in that fresh pasture grass. And so hay has much lower levels of vitamin E, and it also, will degrade over time. So horses that rely mostly on hay can be at risk of having inadequate levels of vitamin E in their diet. And so, I'm picking on winter and horses that otherwise would be on pasture in the summer. But obviously for folks like me who are, in areas where their horses never get on pasture because the climate doesn't allow for pasture, or maybe you're in a boarding situation that doesn't have pasture, this may be a year-round issue, not just a winter issue. But, obviously for horses that get good quality pasture in the summer, this is more of a concern at this point in the winter because they've been on hay now for several months as their main forage source. And so any stores that they might have had of vitamin E have probably kind of dwindled. And so their, vitamin E levels now are probably much lower now than they would have been, say, in October, when the pasture initially started to drop off, the quality started to drop off. And so it's just that sort of perfect storm of your horse has been relying on hay all winter. Their stores that they may have had, may have gone down because the hay isn't really providing very much. And then the weather gets super nice and we all want to go out and ride and exercise our horses, and the pastures haven't really come back yet.
So how quickly does vitamin E degrade in hay?
It's going to start degrading as soon as it's harvested, right? As soon as that sun is, because it's not going to generate any more. And now you've got the sun on it and it's being, heat damaged and broken down. But typical losses are somewhere sort of 30 to 50% during the curing and drying process. And over several months storage, be much higher than that. So, So if you don't have any other source of vitamin E in the diet, it can be quite a dramatic difference between a hay-based diet and a good quality pasture diet.
With spring in the air, I've seen a lot of posts on social media with people asking if they can stop giving vitamin E since their horses are going back out on pasture. Can horses get enough vitamin E from pasture alone?
Yeah, absolutely they can. I mean, I know in speaking with, researchers that look at this in horses, that there are horses that are in good quality pasture and they bring their horses off of pasture and their vitamin E levels are very good. But it depends on, the amount of pasture and the quality of pasture, right? And at this point in the year, I don't think, most people, I mean, you can probably speak to this, right? Being in Iowa, I'm sure your grass is starting to come through, but it's nowhere near as lush as it would be in, say, July. So I think we're a little premature at this point in saying that the pasture alone could support horses at this point in time. And for me, I feel like I don't think there's any research looking at, how much pasture do they have to really eat and how do I know if they're getting enough from pasture? I mean, my sort of common sense approach is that if you're having to supplement your horse's pasture with hay in order for them to maintain their condition, then that pasture probably isn't good enough quality to be providing them with enough vitamin E to meet their needs. But that's just sort of a common sense way of looking at it.
And I think it definitely depends because I test my vitamin E every year. Mm-hmm. When my horse was living in Colorado with very little, I don't even want to call it pasture, with a field that had some grass in it.
I remember that experiment with the rabbit poo.
Right. It had a little bit of grass in it, but his vitamin E every year was between 5 and 6.
Right.
And when we moved to Iowa and I have abundance of lush, perfectly groomed, beautiful pasture, his vitamin E went down between 2.5 and 3.5. I mean, it substantially went down. So it definitely, I mean, that's the reason we test, right?
Right. And
You're
I
just
think
not gonna
actually
know.
you raised a good point. I mean, our listeners that have been listening for a long time will know that you are the queen of grazing with muzzles because you've had ponies on good quality pasture. And so I think you have to remember that you look out there and you see this amazing looking pasture. If you're like yourself and you're putting your horses out on pasture for many hours a day, I mean, your horses are out, hours and hours, right? In the summer.
Well, 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. Yeah.
Yeah. And yet they're in muzzles. So their intake is significantly reduced. And so again, that might not be enough to support their vitamin E levels. Even though the pasture is amazing quality, they're not consuming that much of it because you've put muzzles on them. So I think that's actually worth remembering because it's easy to forget as you walk by the pasture and go, that's a really good quality pasture. That's amazing. And then to remember that your horse actually isn't getting to eat that much of it. But yes, in theory, if your horse were having unlimited access to that amazing quality pasture, then their vitamin E levels should easily be met. And there are studies looking at the amount of vitamin E in good quality pasture, and it's very high and would easily meet the needs of even a horse in hard work. But the reality is that, a lot of horses just don't have access to that. And a lot of horses have access to pasture that's really not good quality. As I said, if you're having to supplement hay in order to maintain your horse's condition, that's probably not a great quality pasture.
What are the signs of vitamin E deficiency in horses?
Yeah, I think the most obvious ones, well, maybe they're not that obvious, but they can be kind of subtle, right? I mean, they're like muscle weakness and stiffness, or, fatigue and poor performance and not recovering from exercise as quickly as you would like. I think one that people don't think about very much is poor top line, right? Not being able to develop top line adequately. I actually just got done before we started recording this, doing a consultation with a client who that's her struggle with her horse, is it's really struggling to put top line on. And, one of my recommendations was that the vet happens to be coming this Friday for spring shots. And so we're going to get her to pull some blood and check vitamin E, because that could be a contributing factor. Looking at the rest of the diet and what she's feeding, I think that could be a contributing factor. Trembling or like muscle, twitching, could be, you might see that, as I said, slow recovery after exercise. Those are the very subtle things. And then, as you get into some of these more severe conditions, it becomes more dramatic, right? You start having horses with neurologic symptoms and the like.
How do I know if my horse needs additional vitamin E?
Yeah, so actually the client I just spoke to is a great example of this, right? So we were chatting with her. I was looking at photographs she'd sent me. I was looking at the diet that she's feeding right now. So, first of all, I would go away and figure out what the horse's vitamin E requirement is. And then I would look at the diet she's feeding and, determine whether that diet that's being fed is meeting those requirements on paper, right? So the horse's work level, what they do for a living, that sets their requirement. And then we can look at, what vitamin E is in the diet, and do those two things match up, right? And if they don't, if the diet is, looking like it's not providing enough, then I'm probably going to assume that diet is, if it's not meeting it on paper, it's probably deficient and the horse is probably deficient. The trick is that even if it's looks good on paper, the horse may still be deficient. So, I start looking at other things too, like, are we relying just on hay for forage? This horse is in Arizona, never gets out on pasture. So yes, this horse didn't have any access to quality pasture. The horse is in work, doesn't have a lot of fat in the diet, and has a really poor looking top line. So these are all things that make me start to think, maybe we have some vitamin E kind of stuff going on here. I'd also be looking for signs, like I mentioned, of muscle soreness, asking about recovery. Does the horse work well? Is the horse stiff when you start working it? Are there any neurological symptoms that you're concerned about? And then I would test the horse's levels, because even when everything looks good on paper and in the horse, even if the horse looks good, the horse may only have marginal levels that over time could result in issues and a progression towards becoming truly deficient. So the horse I worked with today actually looks like, everything lines up, the hay-based diet, the poor top line, a diet that I don't think is actually meeting its needs on paper, I already think that horse is probably vitamin E deficient, and the vet happens to be coming, so we're going to draw blood and we're going to see if it is deficient, and if it is deficient, how deficient. But even if on paper the horse's vitamin E levels looked like they should be meeting their requirement, I would still test that horse's blood levels. And like you mentioned, you do it annually, I do it annually.
So you answered the question because we were talking about your client, but how do you test?
What was your question?
How do you test a horse's vitamin E level?
So it is blood work. So it does require a veterinary visit. It does mean your vet has to come out. And it's not part of a regular CBC panel. So I do get people come to me. They've got they send me blood work on the horse. I ask if they've ever had vitamin E tested. They say maybe, they think so, they don't know. They send me the CBC panel. Vitamin E is not included on a regular blood chemistry panel. Like, you actually have to specifically ask your veterinarian to test vitamin E. And I think it's really important to mention that it's a bit of a tricky draw in the sense that vitamin E is very light sensitive, as are the other fat soluble vitamins. So typically it gets drawn into a foil covered tube. So they actually will cover the vacutainer that they're drawing the blood into. They'll have it wrapped in foil and draw it into that, because as soon as light hits it, it damages the vitamin E, which would negatively impact your results. I know I have one veterinarian that does it that way, one of my vets, and I think another veterinarian doesn't do it that way, but they handle it very quickly. And you can't just chuck it in the truck and drive around all day with it, right? You have to actually handle it really quickly in the moment. So if you want vitamin E drawn, I do think it's worth giving your vet a heads up that you're going to want vitamin E drawn, just so that they are prepared for it and kind of know, how to handle it.
And being near the end of the day, so they don't have it on the truck all day. Right.
Or if they are going to have it on the truck, that they have adequate storage facility with them, right? Like, I know vets that carry a cooler with them or whatever, and they just, put it in the cooler or whatever. But yeah, it does need to be handled properly, or your results, may not be valid. And it takes a bit of a trick. I was talking to one of the vet techs, one of the veterinarians I use, and he was saying that he was teaching a new vet tech how to do it. And they were pulling the blood into this foil covered tube. And she says to him, "How do I know when I've collected enough blood?" Because you can't see. Good question. Yeah. Right? You can't see. So, that was not I'm like, that's your job, not my job. Figure that out. But yeah, he did say that he learned the hard way, because he had drawn some blood into a foil covered tube. Assumed it was all good. The client left. The client had come into the clinic. The client left and went home. And then he uncovered the tube and put on the centrifuge to find that there was not enough blood in the tube to do the test. And he was like, that was a bit embarrassing. So he's like, I always now check before,
send them on their way.
Before you send them on the way. Yeah, exactly. But it is a very easy thing to test, because it is just a blood draw, but it's a little bit complicated in how it has to be handled. So give your vet a heads up.
And let's be honest, it's not a cheap blood test. It's not crazy expensive. It's not crazy expensive, but it is, it is something that is a little bit more than a regular panel. So if you're going to get it done, just prepare.
Yeah.
Don't get shocked by the price.
I mean, I find $150, $200 somewhere in there. I've had it be like $130. I think
I've never had it be $130. Mine's always been between $200 and $300 in both states.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Mine's
and I think every time mine goes to Cornell, so I don't know if that makes a difference or not.
Yes. I think sometimes mine goes to Antec and other places. Yeah. So that may, the lab it goes to, or have you shipping costs associated with that. It has to be obviously handled carefully and shipped carefully. But I do think it's worth, and I hope the cost doesn't put people off doing it, because I do think it's really worth doing. And, to be clear, supplementing vitamin E is not cheap either. So at least this way, if you actually need to be doing it or not. And certainly if you end up with a condition associated with vitamin E deficiency, that's not cheap to manage either.
I was just going to say, we're also going to talk about what happens if your horse is getting too much vitamin E. I'm pretty sure we're going to get to that also. So what is a normal vitamin E blood level in a horse?
So This is interesting. It's changed a little bit recently. So normal blood levels. So deficient is less than 1.5 micrograms per milliliter, right? So that's what you see, the little UG sign. That's what that is. It's micrograms. It's a millionth of a gram. So deficient is less than 1.5. Marginal is 1.5 to 2 micrograms per milliliter. And normal is 2 to 6. And it used to be 2 to 4. However, and I should back up, this differs a little bit by lab. So for example, UC Davis uses the scale that I'm mentioning here. I think Michigan State used this scale that I'm mentioning here. I think Antec does, and Cornell uses a different scale. I'll get to Cornell in a minute. So it used to be that 2 to 4 was deemed normal. And then some work that was done at UC Davis, I mentioned earlier that some of these folks have horses maintained on really good quality pasture, and they were pulling these horses in off of good quality pasture. They were getting nothing to eat except good quality pasture, and their vitamin E levels, serum vitamin E levels were, 6, 7, right? So, and the normal range was set at 2 to 4. Well, how can 6, 7 be abnormal if they're just eating their natural diet, right? They're just eating grass pasture. So they actually sort of extended their normal range up to 6, 2 to 6. So personally, I don't like horses being down like 2 to 3. Like certainly my high performance clients, I want them in the 4 to 6 range. If you've got a retired horse that's, not working much, or you just have to, weekend trail horse is not working super hard, then 3 is perfect. To me, 3 is perfectly fine. But I don't love being around 2. So for personally, the horse at Dartmouth, the horse that some of you will have seen in posts on social media, on my Clarity page, or that we've mentioned in other episodes, when I purchased him, he looked like a vitamin E deficient horse. He had a really angular back end, really kind of peaked, really poor, weak top line. And he had a vitamin E of 2.1. And so technically normal, right? But I'm like, barely. I mean, barely normal. So I actually supplemented him and got him up to initially about 3.5, and then ultimately up to about 5. And I should be retesting him here pretty shortly. So that's my preference. My preference is if they're hard working, like 4 to 6. If they're not working so hard, and then maybe a little bit lower. Cornell have a different scale, and I should have looked it up before I sat here to share this information because I'm trying to recall it off the top of my head. But they basically use where Davis and Michigan or whatever would be 2 to 6, they would be 200 to 600. So they're just using a different, slightly different units. Their top of their range is 1,000, which would be 10 on the UC Davis scale. So they have a slightly higher range for normal again. So I tend to stick with the UC Davis scale. And so as I said, do the 2 to 6, but Cornell, you're going to get 200 to 1,000 back as the normal range. And again, I'm happy if horses are in the sort of, 500 to 600 range if they're working hard.
I also just want to say, part of, we did say that the test is expensive. You and I both do it every year. When I moved to Iowa, if I hadn't have had those tests done before and every year they had been at the same number in Colorado, I would not have even known that his was low because it would have fallen within what the range is. So, going from 5.5, where that's where he was for 5 years. And then when I tested in Iowa, I went down to 2.5. That's a substantial drop, right? And I was seeing some issues, and that was the reason why, I tested early, I think, that year so we could see what the number was at. But you will have a baseline if you start doing this and just make this part of your annual program. It can be helpful.
And it does change.
It does change.
And it's been it's really interesting actually watching, watching how it's changed. And I'll, when we talk about supplementing in a minute, I'll talk a little bit about that. But it is, you're exactly right, is that, and I think what I wanted to say was that I recall having a conversation, with a veterinarian who does a lot of work in this area. And, her comment was, even if your horse comes back normal, like in that normal range, if you're seeing symptoms that suggest a vitamin E deficiency, like muscle soreness, like poor top line, to your point, and your value comes back, say at the low end of normal, then, supplement and get them up into the upper end of normal, right? So
see if you get a change.
Exactly. Right. I mean, and I'm not advocating giving ridiculously stupid levels of supplementation. right? But if your horse is again, which is why testing is so valuable, because there's huge variation in how individual horses utilize vitamin E. And so, you could be giving quite high doses, assuming that your horse's levels are normal, and they might not be. They might be low. So that's why testing is so important.
So if I'm boarding my horse and all the horses are managed similarly,
yep,
and a friend has her horse tested and it comes back normal, can I assume that my horse is also normal?
Wouldn't that be nice? Get your friend to pay for the expensive test. And then, no, sadly. No, it's not. And I really had this brought home to me, golly, years ago, probably 10 years ago now. Time flies. I was working with a client that had 3 horses. There were 2 warm bloods and 1 quarter horse, if I remember. And they were all doing sort of second and third level dressage. She was feeding them all the exact same thing. And she was willing to test all 3 of them. And so we did test all 3 of them. And they all had completely different vitamin E levels. Like one was low, deficient, one was sort of barely normal, and one was at the high end of normal. And, I had heard, like in conversations that I'd had with Dr. Finno does a lot of work in vitamin E, that, there were large individual variances in vitamin E levels, regardless of diet. And I sort of went, stuck that away in the back of my brain and was like, interesting. And, this was the first time I had a client who was willing to test all 3 of her horses. And literally the diet was exactly the same. The amount of vitamin E intake was exactly the same across the 3 horses. And their levels were radically different. And so that really brought home exactly what Dr. Finno had told me. And I was like, wow, look at that. Like, it's true. So, yeah. And I see that in my own 2 horses, right? So as I mentioned, when I bought Dartmouth, he was getting, I want to say about 2,000 IUs in his diet of sort of added vitamin E from various sources. And he had a 2.1. My daughter's pony, I think, was getting about 1,000 IUs, just, in the feed he was getting. And his levels were like 5.5. Right. So there's no,
you just have to test.
You just have to test. Yeah, unfortunately. And I get it. I guess it makes it very tricky if you've got a lot of horses. And I guess if I had a lot of horses, but I couldn't do all of them realistically, I would pick the ones that were giving me, concerns, right? The ones that met my criteria earlier of like, maybe they're not holding, they're not muscling up well, despite the fact, everything else suggests they should be muscling up well. If they're muscle sore, if you find like if you're showing over multiple days and they're just very different on the last day than the first day, and they just don't seem to recover very well. Like, those, if I had say 5 horses and I had to pick which ones I tested, I could only do 2. Well, the one that met that criteria would be the one that I would test.
Yeah. What diseases are linked to low vitamin E?
Yeah, so it's associated with several muscle and neurological disorders in horses. I mentioned earlier the equine neuroaxonal dystrophy, which, as I mentioned before, is the result of, we don't know what the gene is, right? We haven't determined the gene for this condition, but we presume that there is a genetic switch in these predisposed horses that if they are vitamin E deficient at just the right moment in their development, that switch gets turned on and then they develop NAD, and you can't turn that off after that switch has been turned on. That's what we call nutrigenomics. So it's like gene nutrition interaction, which is a really cool area of science that we're learning more and more about across species. And so for that reason, absolutely brood mares I'd be testing, right, the month before they foal, because vitamin E gets transferred in colostrum, which develops in the last month of gestation. So I'd really want to make sure that my mare's vitamin E status is good going into that last month. So probably I'd be testing her, at the beginning of the last trimester to make sure that we have time to fix it if it's too low. And the recommendation is also that foals should be tested before they're weaned to make sure that their levels are also where they need to be. There is a vitamin E deficiency muscle myopathy. And that, again, looks like sort of poor muscling, weakness, and that is fairly easily reversed when the horses are supplemented. There's equine motor neurons disease, which we tend to see in our older equine population, and that does not resolve very easily, even with supplementation. I think it's something like 30% of horses with equine motor neurons disease will recover, and that's it. And there's some thinking that there may be a progression from the vitamin E deficiency muscle myopathy, which we tend to see in sort of middle-aged or mature middle-aged horses, that they then progress to equine motor neurons disease when they get into their sort of late teens, early 20s, and that maybe this is a progressive situation. I don't know that we know that for sure. And then, there are, other, degenerative myoencephalopathy. There's a word for you. There's a vitamin E component there. So, these conditions involve damage to muscles and the nervous system, right? So, vitamin E's antioxidant role is really important in helping to, prevent or reverse these conditions.
So can vitamin E help horses with muscle disorders?
You mean like disorders like PSSM?
Yeah.
Yes, but not directly, right? PSSM is not caused by a vitamin E deficiency. Shivers is not caused by a vitamin E deficiency, right? And again, I see this a lot. People giving, high doses of vitamin E to horses with shivers. Like shivers is not a vitamin E deficiency condition, right? But if your horse is vitamin E deficient, it will suffer from muscle soreness, excuse me, and, have muscle problems in addition to the issues it's also having because it has shivers. So it's like you've got a double whammy going on in those horses. And so common sense says that to give those horses a fighting chance, you want to set them up as, best you can with having adequate vitamin E levels. But the vitamin E is not directly impacting shivers. It's not directly impacting PSSM, right? It's just helping those horses that are already struggling with muscle pain and muscle issues to not have another muscle condition as well. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. I think that I understand what you mean by that. And I do see that also when people are offering advice for things like shivers and vitamin E is coming up and they're talking about that. So is vitamin E important for neurological health?
Yeah, absolutely, because it plays a protecting role on the nerve cells. So it helps protect nerve tissue from oxidative damage and supports, normal nerve signaling. Oh dear. And, muscle nerve communication as well. So low vitamin E levels have been associated with a number of neurological diseases, like I mentioned, like equine motor neurons disease. And it is this role in nerve health that results in many people supplementing horses with high levels of vitamin E. EPM is another one that comes to mind, right? So
it's so funny that you're bringing up EPM because I always see this on the EPM group and I'm like, we are not talking about EPM. I didn't want to mention it, but here you are. So you're bringing it up. So go ahead.
Yeah,
it is
right here.
Always
this like
recommended.
my small soapbox.
This is all we're talking about.
I feel like we need like a drum roll or something, like Claire's soapbox for EPM. So lots of people give a ton of vitamin E for EPM, but in my conversations with experts that work in vitamin E research, like I'm not aware of any solid evidence that vitamin E helps cure EPM, right? In some horses that already have, good levels of vitamin E, giving them another 10,000 IUs could result in them having like super high levels of vitamin E. So again, like I said with the shivers horses, if your horse has EPM and is also vitamin E deficient, that horse has a huge disadvantage because EPM is associated with, nerve damage, the lining of the nerves, etc., and oxidative damage. But it's a protozoal condition. EPM is caused by protozoa that are, attacking the central nervous system. So vitamin E is not going to do anything to get rid of the protozoa, right?
Correct.
It may help with, some of the damage and the oxidative damage that might result from those protozoa sort of like feasting, for want of a better expression, on the central nervous system, but it's not a vitamin E deficiency condition. And if your horse has adequate levels of vitamin E, especially if it's already at the upper end of the normal range, giving more vitamin E is unlikely to have an effect other than potentially push you into having too much vitamin E, which there are consequences of giving too much vitamin E. It is not a more is better mineral vitamin, right? So I don't recommend giving high-level doses of vitamin E to these horses unless you've tested them and determined that they're deficient and they need extra support. So again, we need to test these horses to see whether or not they also have a vitamin E deficiency that needs to be affected so that they're set up as best they can to heal and recover from having EPM.
Okay, that was our episode on EPM. Moving on. We've had so many people ask us to cover EPM. Okay, that's all we've got for EPM. We're moving on. So we've discussed pasture and hay, but are there any other foods that are high in vitamin E?
Yeah, I mean, some of the richest, as I mentioned, pasture, right, is the richest and best source. Some vegetable oils get marketed as being high in vitamin E, but relative to what? And this is the issue with labeling, right? This is why we're not really supposed to say on supplement labels, higher or increased or elevated, because it's like compared to what? And yes, for example, I see another one of my soapbox. This is turning into a soapbox episode. For example, camelina oil, which I love camelina oil. It's it's like flax oil. It's a high in omega-3 oil. Great, good source of omega-3s. Often you see it marketed as high vitamin E, which then makes horse owners go, oh my gosh, that's great because I can give this horse this oil, have it, get omega-3s that they also need, and also support its vitamin E status. But the amount of vitamin E in camelina oil is really quite low. It's just high compared to other like plant oils. So there's more vitamin E in camelina oil than flax oil, right? But the amount is so minuscule, it's going to make no meaningful contribution to that horse's vitamin E requirement. What it does do is that it does make that oil a little more stable on the shelf, right? So that oil is less likely to go rancid because it has naturally occurring vitamin E in it. And vitamin E helps fats, not just in the body, but also in products, not go rancid, which is why higher fat commercial feeds, two reasons why higher fat commercial feeds tend to have higher levels of vitamin E in them when you compare them to other feeds with lower fat. The first reason being is that we need to make sure that fat in that feed doesn't go rancid, right? So we put mixed tocopherols or some form of vitamin E in that feed to protect the fat so it's available to your horse in a non-rancid form. And second of all, when we feed horses higher levels of fats, their vitamin E requirement goes up because fat tends to get oxidized, and feeding higher fat diets increases the exposure to free radicals in your horse. And so that horse is then going to need slightly higher levels of vitamin E in the diet. But no, this is a very long way of saying that vegetable oils are not a good source of vitamin E from the standpoint of supporting your horse's daily vitamin E requirement. There are some oils out there where manufacturers have added additional vitamin E, but that's not naturally occurring vitamin E that was in the seed, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think so. How much vitamin E should my horse get per day?
So as I hinted at earlier, right, that's going to be dependent on the size of the horse, how much they weigh, and their workload and kind of what they do for a living. But typically, so about 1,100-pound horse, 500-kilogram horse, we're looking at, somewhere between sort of 500 and 1,000 IUs per day. If they're on pasture, they might not need quite so much. If they're, It's without pasture, really 1,000 IUs, right? So 500. I think of a 500 kilogram horse, 1,100 pound horse. I'm going to, 1,000 IUs should cover that horse. If they're working harder, then a little bit higher. The NRC requirement levels are a little lower than some of the other research that's been done. So I believe it was Kentucky Equine Research did some work looking at vitamin E requirements in horses and determined that, their research suggested that the NRC requirements are a little bit on the low end. So my approach is typically to make sure that I'm meeting the horse's NRC requirement with the diet that we've put together. And then we test to see whether or not that amount is actually adequately meeting the horse's requirement. And then if it doesn't, then we add a supplement on top. And obviously horses with neurological issues, with diagnosed neurological issues may need some higher levels. But again, I would do that with testing first.
Don't most commercial feeds contain vitamin E?
The better ones, yeah. So most of your big national brands, they are going to be adding what we call a premix into their fortified feeds that will have a vitamin packet in it, which will include vitamin E. However, most feeds are using synthetic forms of vitamin E that may not be quite as absorbable. And I'm okay with that. I actually, I've sort of gone back and forth. I will say that my philosophy about vitamin E has evolved over the length of time that I've been an equine nutrition consultant, right? I used to recommend that all my clients, we'd do the diet and then we'd add 2,500 IUs of natural vitamin E. And then in speaking with Dr. Finno and learning about the individual variation of amongst horses, I stopped making that recommendation. And now my approach has changed to we make sure we're meeting the horse's minimum requirement on paper. And most of the time when I put a diet together, we're well over that minimum. We're normally 150, 200% of that minimum. And then we test and then we supplement based on testing. And so with that being the case, it really doesn't matter to me if the source of vitamin E in the feed is natural or synthetic. Natural vitamin E is more expensive. And so that feed is going to cost more and still may not be enough to adequately meet that horse's individual, needs for vitamin E. So personally, at this point, I'm kind of totally okay with feeds having synthetic vitamin E in them because I'm going to tell everybody they need to test. And then we're going to, supplement based on those test results. Because like I said, in my own horses, they were getting, well over their requirement met by their feed. And one was normal and one was deficient. Yeah.
If I do need to add additional vitamin E supplement, what should I be looking for?
So when it comes to a supplement, I do want natural vitamin E, right? So, and that is because it is the most, it's the natural form of the vitamin E is more bioavailable. And so specifically, you're looking for D-alpha tocopherol, right? That is the natural form, or it might be D-alpha tocopherol acetate, right? The acetate form is a little more stable. So quite often in feed products especially, you'll see acetate forms because they are less affected by other ingredients in the feed. And then we have the water-soluble forms or the micellized forms of vitamin E that are liquids. There are several of those on the market, and those are highly absorbable. So if I have a horse that is truly deficient in vitamin E based on the test results, then we're going to use a water-soluble liquid or micellized form of vitamin E first. If we're like that example I gave earlier, where let's say a horse has a vitamin E level of like 3, but it's a high level performance horse, and I would prefer it to be, between 4 and 6, then I'm going to use, I don't necessarily have to use the liquid form in that instance. I might rely on the powdered or pelleted D-alpha tocopherol natural form. But if I have a true deficiency, I'm going to use the liquids because they are far more bioavailable and they're going to fix things more quickly.
And if you are boarding, please check with your boarding facility before, because some boarding facilities, it is hard when you have the liquid to feed it, or to have your feeders try to measure it out to give it to them. So make sure if you are in a boarding situation, you check and make sure that they're going to be okay with feeding that.
Yeah, because you also don't, and I should just say, it's not heat stable, right? So for me, when I was in a boarding situation where we did not have a temperature controlled feed room, I couldn't leave the vitamin E in the feed room. I had to put it in the fridge, and it doesn't do great in the fridge either. Like, it kind of has a temperature range that it's supposed to be kept in, and that was not the temperature of our barn fridge. And so that's actually, for me, I did the liquid, I want to say, when I first got him, and I thought he was a little bit low. That would have been in like February, March. I did liquid for like 2 or 3 months. And then once our temperatures got stupid hot, that's when I switched to doing the powdered form, because it is more stable.
Well, I did the same thing, but I didn't do it because it was hot. I did it because the liquid is a mess. It's just,
it is.
It's so much easier to just do pellets or powder.
Yeah.
Some people are giving a really high dose of vitamin E, like 10,000 IUs a day.
Yep.
Is it safe to give high doses of vitamin E?
Yeah, I think, as I hinted on this earlier, right? I mean, it's considered one of the safer vitamins to supplement. But, extremely high doses, again, I would want to test. I'd want to know what my horse's levels are. Like, it's unnecessary and costly if you don't need it. B, it does have some health implications. It gets stored, like I mentioned, it gets stored in the lipid bilayer around cells, right? So it can be linked. Excess vitamin E has been linked to like membrane thinning, because you start changing the composition of that bilayer and putting more vitamin E in it. And so then the sort of, the fluidity or the, of the membrane changes. And so that's not necessarily good, right? You need a certain structure to your cell membranes. I understand it can also impact like calcium status in bones, right? It has an impact there. It can have an impact on the liver, because it is is stored in the liver. And so no, I mean, it's not a benign thing. Like, just throwing more and more IUs of vitamin E willy-nilly is not a good idea. So I would test. And if your horse is super low, then giving 10,000 IUs, or even if it's normal, if you're still seeing symptoms, even though it's normal, then okay, maybe I would add more, but I'd be doing that under veterinary supervision.
Right. And when we say it's not cheap, like the liquid form is about $125 a bottle.
For a liter.
It's not. Yeah, for the liter. It's not cheap. If I supplement vitamin E, should I also supplement with selenium? I see this a lot brought up. So do those two need to go together?
No. How's that for short answer? Sometimes, but yes and no. So, there's selenium, generally, I don't see a lot of selenium deficiency in diets, because I think people that live in geographic regions where selenium levels are low in the soil, and so the forages are low in selenium, are very aware of that. And, we now have selenium yeasts available that are very bioavailable and are being used in a lot of feeds. And if you're feeding your commercial feed the way it's designed, you're likely going to be getting enough selenium from your feed. And my biggest concern with having selenium in a supplement with vitamin E is that the two of them coupled together, right? So let's say, I'm making this up, let's say the supplement has 2,500 IUs of vitamin E and 1 milligram of zinc. And I want to feed, 7,500 IUs of vitamin E. Well, now I'm feeding 3 milligrams of selenium, right? On top of what's already in my commercial feed or whatever. And so I would I don't like feeding vitamin E and selenium combined for that reason, because I worry that people are going to get crazy and think more is better and start throwing more vitamin E at it, and then not realize that they're also throwing selenium at it. And, selenium toxicity occurs at, a much lower rate than, it's a thing. And again, there is a fairly large window of safety with selenium, but it is significantly less than other trace minerals. And, you do see selenium toxicity in horses in certain parts of the country, especially where selenium levels are high in forages, like in the Dakotas and stuff. So my preference is not to have the two added together, and it makes me a little uncomfortable, and I worry about, that random situation where it goes wrong and has sort of really catastrophic consequences.
You mentioned earlier that vitamin E gets absorbed with fat in the diet. Should vitamin E be fed with fat or with oil?
It can help, especially, if you've got forms that are not as bioavailable as obviously that's one of the benefits of doing the water soluble or the micellized is you don't need fat, right? They're water soluble. They just get absorbed without fat. So that's one of the reasons why they're so effective. Most diets have, some amount of fat in them. If you're feeding some flax or some omega-3 source, or have you're feeding a performance feed that has some added fat, you're probably going to be fine. But there is, certainly, having a little fat in the diet. I know people that will do powdered vitamin E and then they just sort of, drop a glug of oil over the top of it because they just feel that that's going to help with absorption. I don't know that. I'm not sure if we've looked at that in research or not, like feeding, whether adding some oil to diets helped increase the vitamin E intake. That'll actually be an interesting study for somebody to do if it hasn't been done. It'd be a good master's study. But yeah, I typically, I think there's enough fat in the diet that I'm not overly concerned about it.
So I've done my testing.
Mm-hmm.
My vitamin E is low.
Yeah.
So I start feeding vitamin E. How long is it going to take to raise the horse's vitamin E level?
So with those liquid forms, it can be very quick. I think the research has shown that it, even within 12, 24 hours, there's a noticeable increase in their serum vitamin E status. But obviously with the powders and the like, they aren't quite as bioavailable, and the synthetic is really not as bioavailable. And I don't think we've actually really talked about synthetic versus natural. I keep mentioning it, but I don't think I really have actually.
Is that the D and the DL?
Yeah, exactly. So the D alpha tocopherol is natural. DL alpha tocopherol is synthetic, and it's not as biologically active. My brain just suddenly gone. Ugh.
You mean bioavailable?
Yeah, well, it's not like it isn't as bioavailable. It's not as so you need more of the synthetic to have the same effect as the natural. And there is some research suggesting that even when you add more, it may not be enough to get some of these horses where they need to be. So, but it does get absorbed. The synthetic does get absorbed. And as I mentioned earlier, it is what's getting used in most feeds that are using vitamin E. I can tell you if a supplement has natural vitamin E in it or a feed has natural vitamin E in it, they're going to tell you all about it because it's more expensive. And right. So they're definitely going to put that in their marketing. They will want you to know that their vitamin E is natural. Vitamin E can get labeled as vitamin E supplement. It can be labeled as D-alpha tocopherol acetate, DL alpha tocopherol acetate. So yeah, the DL is synthetic. And as I said, I'm fine with that being in most feed sources. As I said, my pony who got 1,000 IUs per day of synthetic vitamin E had a vitamin E status of 5.5, a very respectable vitamin E, right? My horse that got over 2,000 IUs of synthetic vitamin E had a vitamin E of 2.1. So again, like I don't mind if feed companies are using synthetic vitamin E because I'm going to test and if I need extra, I will then pay for the natural in a supplement, and then I'm not paying for the natural if I don't need it, like in the case of my pony, right? So that it generally a couple of weeks, you'll see a measurable increase in blood levels. Veterinarians, we typically will retest after 30, 60 days after a deficiency. I'll implement the new diet and then the vet will come out 30 to 60 days later. I normally say 4 to 6 weeks to test them again to make sure that it's actually where it needs to be.
If I decide to supplement with a liquid form of vitamin E, will I need to stay on that form forever?
Some individual horses will need to be on the liquid forever, but generally you can get them weaned off of the liquid gradually over time and transition to the powdered form, or I am aware of at least one form of powdered vitamin E that's actually been put into a pellet, which is nice because there are horses that don't like powders. And they're all the similar D-alpha tocopherol acetate, natural vitamin E. So you would go from the liquid. So what you would do is you'd be diagnosed with your deficiency. You would put the horse on the liquid. Let's say you do 5,000 IUs of liquid. Then you're going to wait a month and retest. And now their levels, let's hopefully they're normal. They're back to being, where you want them to be. You can either keep them on the liquid, or you can say, okay, well, I'm going to transition them to the powder. So I'm going to, add powder on top of the liquid, right? So now let's say they're getting like 8,000 IUs total, because I've got 3,000 in powder and 5,000 in liquid. And then I'm going to gradually pull the liquid away while I'm also increasing the amount of powder that I'm added. And I might end up at 8,000 IUs of powder total coming from powder, whereas previously I had 5,000 coming from liquid. And then once I've done that transition over, some time, probably a couple of months, I'm going to retest again and make sure that my 8,000 IUs of powder are doing the same job that 5,000 IUs of liquid did. Right. And so that's kind of what I did with my horse, is that when he was at 2.1, I think I put him on, and he was getting about 2,000 IUs in his feed. I think I only added about 2,500 IUs of liquid. And we got him up to like 3.5, low threes, something like that. And I thought, well, actually, that's okay. It's an improvement, but I'd like him to be higher. So, and then the weather got super hot, so the liquid wasn't really feasible for me to handle anymore. So then I went and bought a powdered or pelleted form that had a dosing scoop of 8,000 IUs per day. So I switched him to that, which was I did it pretty much overnight, because going from 2,500 IUs to 8,000 IUs is a pretty big difference. And so I did that overnight, partly because of the weather issue. And then I had him retested. By that point, it was like the fall, and I had him retested, and his levels were 7.7. And I was like, well, this is clearly working. And so then I cut him back to 4,000 IUs. And I don't think I've retested him since then. And so he's due to be retested in the next, within the next couple of weeks. So it'll be really interesting to see where he is. Now he's getting about 1,500 IUs in his feed and 4,000 IUs powder pellets.
We'll report back once we get the test.
We'll get his new test. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to watch him. And then, the pony, I've never put him on a vitamin E supplement, but he went from about a 5.5 to like a 5. And so it'll be interesting to test him and see if he's still in that 5 range, or whether he's dropped. And again, like, I've gone to a situation now where we actually do have some pasture access now, which when I started all this testing, we didn't have any pasture. So
yeah. Well, I think we covered a lot. And I think the moral of this episode is, if you'd like to give vitamin E, you should run a test. I feel like that's all we said. And we're not like trying to beat a dead horse. That sounds terrible in a horse podcast, but it is really important to not just start feeding vitamin E and asking Facebook how much to feed and just willy-nilly. Just get the test. Get the test.
Yep, I agree. I think that really has become my mantra, not only personally, but professionally. All the clients that I work with, we make a change in the diet. And then after they've implemented the diet I've put together for them, after about 4 to 6 weeks, I ask them to test, and we go from there.
For our listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com, and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at clarityequine.com.
We know that if you're like us, you're probably listening to this while driving or doing barn chores. But when your hands are free, if you'd share it with your friends on social media, and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, it helps other horse lovers like you to find us.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.